Our last and final speaker is David Benjamin. He's the founder and principal of the architectural firm called The Living, which is based in New York City. And he's going to be discussing, well, his talk is called Adaptation. So who knows what that means, and I think he'll help explain what he's trying to envision with that.
So it's great to be here, and I'm just going to kind of jump right into our approach and our projects at The Living, which I think in some ways follow well in the sequence of presentations. It will share some similarities to some of the stuff that Lynn and her group are working on, and probably touch on some of the work of others. But I should say up front that we do research and design through real-world applied projects. And so we're often trying to imagine and redesign things for tomorrow, but with kind of real-world constraints today by making full-scale functioning prototypes of our ideas today with all of the kind of friction that it requires to make it work in the real world. So our work has involved in the past few years a kind of intersection of biology, computation, and design. And this will probably be familiar after the talks from the conference so far, but we certainly think that biology of today is very different than biology of 100 years ago, and certainly biology before that. Of course, architects have been fascinated by biology for many years, but only recently has it been possible to do things like this. This is from a lab that we collaborate with, using microfluidics to grow cells in isolation instead of in an organism, using quantum dots to visualize the neurons firing in a tadpole, a live tadpole, and doing things like seeing at all, and then studying stem cells as they send molecular signals to each other and determine whether to grow into heart tissue, bone tissue, skin tissue, et cetera. We've also been working with some biology labs, including the Lars Dietrich lab at Columbia University, to take some of the amazing properties of, say, natural organic growth, like the growth of these biofilms about the size of a quarter, and apply some techniques of computation, such as machine learning and computer vision, to try to understand what they're doing and encapsulate it in a computer model. And that's exciting for me, because once we can do that, once we can have a computer model, even if it's a rough computer model of what's happening with natural biological growth, then we can potentially start using it as part of a design ecosystem. And I'm going to kind of skip this slide to start with three approaches that we have been experimenting with in our studio that we think are particularly relevant and interesting and useful kind of in this context of using nature, using live organisms, in some cases a version of editing nature in order to make kind of real applications. So there are going to be three approaches, and the first one is biocomputation, and by that I mean using actual living organisms as tiny computers to solve a problem in a different context and often at a different scale. And this project started with a real-world commission by the airplane manufacturer Airbus to redesign kind of their process for design itself for making airplanes, but starting, of course, with a kind of in an incremental way with this component you see here in red called a partition. And of course, everyone's seen this component many times, and in some ways, it's one of the most boring components of an airplane. But it actually is very challenging to design from a structural engineering point of view. And so you can see here a crash test with crash test dummies of the certification process for the partition that's flying today in Airbus planes. And just by kind of watching the response of those crash test dummies to the forces, you get the sense that in 0.4 of a second, this is the amount of force that this panel has to withstand. And it's worth noting that it's not only a lot of force that the panel has to withstand, but there are a lot of geometric constraints that make this a hard problem to solve. In other words, you can only attach this panel to the fuselage in 4 points, 2 at the top and 2 at the bottom. There has to be the fold-down cabin attendant seat, which you saw in the previous slide. And that has to be hanging off of the panel just on one side. So that's a very asymmetrical load, which could be a challenge. The panel can only be about 1 inch thick. And to top it off, you have to be able to remove that center area, the smaller shape embedded there. Because if people get injured these days in the seats, the seating area of an airplane, you have to be able to put the injured person on a stretcher and bring them around the corner out through the door. That doesn't work with the normal turning radius of the walls, like right next to each other, so you have to be able to remove a slot from the wall. I mean, it sounds simple, but that's exactly where a structural engineer would want to place some of the heaviest structure. So it's at this point that we turned to a version of biocomputing, and we used this fairly famous example of slime mold growth. And to me, one of the fascinating things about slime mold growth is that it creates an adaptive network that is both efficient and redundant. So slime mold is starting in that center area, as you can see in the video. It's growing out to reach sources of food, which are those white dots. And it's doing that in a way that's efficient, so it uses a small amount of connective material, parts of itself, its own body, to connect the dots, but it's also redundant in that if you remove one of the paths, typically it can route around the problem. And although it's an entirely different material and system, we thought this two-dimensional adaptive network that's efficient and redundant could be a good way to solve a more or less two-dimensional structural problem. So we created a kind of custom algorithm loosely modeled on the slime mold growth, used a version of evolutionary computing, or a kind of artificial version of evolution in the computer, to explore many design options and ultimately arrive at something that's very different than what a standard engineering approach would create. Part of the power of this approach and of using the computer is that you can generate, evaluate, and evolve literally thousands and tens of thousands of design options. They're shown in the previous slide as their geometry, but we also have these very large data sets, and we can use some techniques of data analysis to color code the designs by their type of design, almost like their digital DNA that creates the kind of designs. You can sort them according to your two goals. So in this case, we want to be low on the x-axis and on the y-axis near the origin point to minimize the amount of weight of the object and also minimize the displacement under stress. You can hone in on the mathematically best set of designs through, again, other kind of computer techniques. And ultimately, this allows us to use a variety of techniques, starting with what we call a kind of biological algorithm derived from slime mold, but then extending to some other types of computation and engineering to create a new version of designing lighter weight airplane parts. Just like natural systems, we can apply this at multiple scales. So without going into too much detail, I'll just note that we start with the kind of problem description on the left, the shape that we have to work with. We create a network of these thin gray lines in the middle, but then every thin gray line can in itself be made up of a bunch of tiny red lines, so we can reapply the optimization process at a different scale. So here's a different view of that. You see that we create first these just kind of standard profile bars, and then a kind of micro lattice of tiny bars that make up those bigger bars. As I mentioned, this is a real world project, and we have worked with our collaborators at Airbus to create now what is the largest metal 3D printed airplane component, which is designed to be certified and fly in the plane. So we're trying to push some limits of techniques in design, but also use all of the constraints of real-world materials, production, and certification. Here are some of the components printed on the bed of a 3D printer. And here's the way that it will kind of assemble with the very thin cover on the front. And ultimately, the reason we're doing this and the reason that Airbus is kind of investing in this kind of research is that they want to reduce the weight of airplane parts. That translates to a reduction in the fuel consumption, which obviously saves money, but it also saves on carbon emissions. And that's a big concern for Airbus and the whole aerospace industry right now. So compared to the existing partition on the left, our partition weighs about 50% less, and it's just as strong, even a little bit stronger. We have created this in full scale, and it's about to undergo the dramatic 16G crash test in a couple of months. The second approach that I want to talk about is biosensing. So the first one, biocomputing, this one, biosensing, and this one means using actual living organisms. We just heard some great versions of it from Lynn, but in our case, we're using actual living organisms so far without any gene editing or bioengineering. But we think this technique could be enhanced potentially by this kind of engineering. But using actual living organisms in order to sense conditions of their environment and respond accordingly. And the context for this project is a public interface to water quality. So this is a photograph of an early installation that we did of a network of floating lights. You can see them in blue here, right off of Manhattan, and you can see the Manhattan Bridge there and the Brooklyn Bridge in the background. The lights change color, and they give the public an interface to the quality of the water, a condition that's normally invisible, but that we think is important to the life of the city. So the kind of physical basis of the project is these 6-foot-long floating tubes that have lights above water and sensors below water. We have used some of the materials, digital materials of the so-called Internet of Things, sensors and small microcontrollers attached to LED lights. But recently we've added to the mix actual living biosensors, and by this I mean live mussels. And as you probably know, and as you can see here in this video, mussels open and close their shells a small amount as part of their natural living conditions. So you can see these mussels kind of pulsing around a little bit in this sped up video. But what's interesting to me is that it turns out that the rate and the amount that mussels open and close their shells is an incredibly sensitive and sophisticated detector of water pollution. And so if you attach a $2 Hall effect sensor to one half of a mussel's shell and an inexpensive magnet to the other half, then you can get a digital signal based on this very complex biological function. And you can basically harness a mussel to be a detector of water pollution that in some ways is better than our kind of most sophisticated single-purpose digital sensors. So we can get a mussel sensor for a couple dollars, and it could be better than a $10,000 dissolved oxygen sensor. So that's certainly an interesting way to maybe save money in design, but what's more interesting to me is that it kind of represents an example of the possibility that we can combine artificial intelligence with natural intelligence. In other words, we can combine the best the computer has to offer, the holy grail of AI, with a kind of evolved intelligence that already exists around us in the natural world. And we could think of using them each as part of our design palette and potentially hybridizing them. And to me, that as a designer, that opens up a whole new world of possibilities, much beyond this project, for ways that we could approach design problems. So back to this installation. Here you see our floating network of lights. This was an early prototype installation in the East River in the context of other lights in the city. And here you see an example of a kind of tipping point in the data. So this is the kind of interface we'll offer to the public. A kind of warm reddish quality means that the water is a little worse than it was a week ago, and a blue color means the reverse. So that was just a tipping point in the data that we captured there. Like many of our projects, we create kind of quick prototypes to test ideas, but this particular prototype has grown into a commission to do a larger scale permanent installation commissioned by the City of New York. And so this is going to go into construction in the late summer. And my third and final example and approach is biomanufacturing, and this one means using actual living organisms as tiny factories to make the building blocks of our buildings and cities and objects. And I'm going to show now a video that we made as an entry into a competition. This is an architectural competition for the Museum of Modern Art and MoMA PS1 to design a structure in their courtyard. And this was our vision, inspired by some of the examples of other people in this room and some of the work that Lynn had mentioned. So the idea of the project, and the reason I'm showing this video, is this kind of encapsulated the idea before we started to encounter the constraints of actually making it real. The idea of the project was to use biomanufacturing, to use a living organism as a way to make building blocks. But more than that, it was also to see if we could create a new approach to design and construction with almost no waste, almost no energy required, and almost no carbon emissions. And also an approach that would be biodegradable. And I think we'll see some of the similarities to the materials in the drone that was mentioned earlier. But at this point, our idea was that maybe we could start with something like the Earth's carbon cycle, this endless healthy loop of growth and decay and regrowth. And in contrast to typical architectural approaches, maybe we could take low-value raw materials. We could take waste rather than high-value raw material. Maybe we could spend a very small amount of energy converting raw material into building blocks instead of typically spending a huge amount of energy to do that. Maybe we could create a normal, typical building, and then at the end of the useful life of that building, return all of the matter, all of the physical stuff of that building back to the carbon cycle instead of putting our construction waste in landfills for hundreds or thousands of years as we typically do. How could we possibly do that? It seems kind of too good to be true, especially today. But we used this, which has already been described a couple times in these events. And this is a microscope video of the growth of mycelium. So this is the kind of filament-like branching structure of fungi, as sometimes as the root-like structure of mushrooms. And it turns out that you can take this kind of beautiful natural process and take this material of mycelium and combine it with agricultural waste, not the high-value part of agriculture, so not something like the corn kernels, but the low-value part of agriculture, like the chopped-up corn stalks. Pack it into a mold of almost any shape, and in about 5 days, which you see here sped up, it will create a solid object. It will grow into a solid object. And you can potentially use those kind of solid objects for a variety of things. So this is some video footage of Ecovative, a startup in upstate New York that is creating mycelium-based materials for use in packaging. And we approached Ecovative and collaborated with them to create a new kind of architectural brick out of this material. Since nobody had made large-scale outdoor architecture out of this material before, we had to do an incredible amount of testing. Here's one of our bricks being crushed with 100,000 pounds of force at a testing lab at Columbia University. We also tested small assemblies of bricks. And we were doing this in part to learn about this somewhat unknown material. But we were also doing it just based on the practicality of getting the project done. In other words, as we went to our structural engineers at Arup, our great collaborators on the project, one of the first things we learned, and it seems obvious, of course, is that their proprietary structural engineering software, and for that matter, any structural engineering software in the world, doesn't have a drop-down menu item for mushroom bricks when you're specifying what the material is that you're working with. So we had to develop that, that material profile through testing. We also had some challenges in creating a complex form with this material, in part because you can't cut mycelium bricks on site to make specific shapes that will compromise their durability. So we created some custom computer algorithms to figure out how to solve basically a fitting problem and a stacking problem. We had to fit a certain number of fixed size bricks onto courses of different sizes as you go up in the structure. And we had to make sure every brick overlapped with with 2 bricks below it with at least 2 inches of overlap. And that was a problem that was easy to describe but difficult to solve with this complex geometry. When we arrived on site to actually make this for real, we had done a lot of research, a lot of testing, solved a lot of problems, but there were still some things that we had to figure out in the field. And at this point, we brought into our research on materials and biology and computation a kind of ecosystem of intelligence and labor. In other words, we had Columbia University graduate students in architecture who know a lot about computation and form, and New York City brick masons who know a lot about stacking objects. And each of them had a different experience and expertise, but none of them had made this kind of thing in this way before. So there was a really interesting layer of problem solving and labor and intelligence in the project as well. So as I'm wrapping up here, here's a photo of the final structure in the context of the typical glass and steel buildings of Manhattan in the background, and the traditional clay brick buildings of MoMA PS1. Our project was in many ways a kind of test at a medium scale of this idea. The structure was about 41 feet tall, and it used 10,000 bricks. So this was a test, like, could we really make something out in the world like this? Would it work? But in addition to being a kind of technical experiment to test the technical performance of the material, it was a kind of creative experiment or an atmospheric experiment. As designers, we were curious what it would be like to stand inside of this structure, what would be the qualities of light and shadow and pattern, what would be the experience of looking at a material that was rough and organic and slightly unfamiliar in the foreground, but having it disappear into something that looked more knowable and familiar in the background. And finally, the ultimate test of these installations at MoMA PS1, which happen every summer now for the past 15 years, is their ability to host a party. Because every Saturday, 5,000 people come to this courtyard to hear experimental electronic music. And this was the first Saturday, which was a kind of thrilling but terrifying moment for us, when this unknown experiment and this new approach to materials was literally climbed on and touched and smelled and scratched by the general public. But in the end, that was totally fitting for us, because this idea of bringing a new experiment in architecture and sometimes in biology out into the world, it's fitting for us that it would happen in public, in culture, in society, not merely kind of in our own studio, and not merely on a kind of hidden corner of a construction lot, the way a lot of facade prototypes are created in the world of architecture. And of course, there was a kind of life of its own that it took on in a kind of public reaction and discussion through new social media technologies. Part of the idea of the project was to see if we might be able to create a local ecosystem of materials and energy and flows. And then finally, what we were most interested in the project was the ability to deconstruct it at the end of the summer, take all of those bricks, crumble them into smaller pieces and combine them with yard waste and food scraps and bacteria and worms. And then in 60 days, true to the promise and idea of the project, all of that stuff, all of that physical matter that made this temporary building was returned to soil, which we then gave to the city for tree planting and even community gardens. The community gardens aspect shows that it's high enough quality soil and non-toxic enough to grow food out of. And so I guess, you know, to conclude, the big idea out of the project that we're taking forward is that maybe as architects and designers, we should think of designing to disappear as much as we typically think of designing to appear. Thank you.